Naples, Italy, December 1954. Lucky Luciano sat at a small desk in his modest apartment overlooking the bay. He'd been in exile for 8 years now, deported from America, forced to watch his empire from across an ocean, growing older, growing weaker, growing increasingly aware that his time was running out. He had a pen in his hand, paper before him, and something he needed to say to a man he might never see again. The letter he wrote that night would become the most personal document Lucky Luciano ever produced. A confession of sorts, an acknowledgement of things he'd never spoken aloud. A message to the one person outside his immediate family who he trusted completely. Bumpy Johnson. This is the story of the letter Lucky Luciano wrote from Italy. The words that revealed who he really was, and what they tell us about the most important relationship in his criminal career. To understand the letter, you need to understand Luciano's state of mind in 1954. He was 57 years old. His health was deteriorating. The dreams of returning to America had faded to fantasy. The empire he'd built was being run by others, and he could only watch from afar as decisions were made without his input. The deportation had been more than exile. It had been a kind of death. Luciano had defined himself through power, through control, through the ability to shape events. Now he had none of that. He was just an old man in a foreign country, living on money smuggled from the organization he'd created but could no longer command. In that isolation, certain things became clearer. Luciano had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people he couldn't trust, partners who would betray him for advantage, associates who smiled while calculating how to bring him down. Even his closest confidants were always suspect, always potentially dangerous. But Bumpy Johnson had been different. For almost 20 years since their agreement at the Cotton Club in 1937, Bumpy had been completely reliable. Every payment arrived on time. Every piece of information proved accurate. Every promise was kept. In a world of lies, Bumpy had been honest. In a world of betrayal, Bumpy had been loyal. In a world where everyone wanted something, Bumpy had asked only for what was fair. Luciano had never fully acknowledged what that meant to him, had never expressed even to himself how much he valued the partnership. Pride, perhaps, or the fear of showing weakness, or simply the habits of a lifetime spent hiding his true feelings. But now, in exile, with time running out, those barriers seemed less important. He began to write. The letter started formally, as Luciano's correspondence always did. Dear Mr. Johnson, I hope this letter finds you well. I have received the reports from New York, and am pleased that business continues satisfactorily. But after a few paragraphs of business matters, the tone changed. I find myself thinking about the past more often now. Perhaps that is what exile does to a man. With little to occupy the present and no control over the future, the mind drifts backward. I think about our first meeting. That night at the Cotton Club, you walked in alone, without guards, without backup. Sat down across from me as if we were equals. And we were. I knew it the moment you refused to show fear. I have met many men in my life, powerful men, dangerous men, men who controlled armies and fortunes. Most of them disappointed me eventually. Most of them proved to be less than they appeared. You never disappointed me. Never once. In all our years together, you were exactly what you claimed to be. Do you know how rare that is? How valuable? Luciano wrote about the nature of their partnership. We came from different worlds. You know this. Everyone knows this. A colored man from the South. An Italian from the slums of New York. By every calculation, we should have been enemies. Competitors at best, certainly not partners, certainly not equals. But I never saw you as colored. I saw you as capable, as intelligent, as someone who understood the game as well as anyone I'd ever met, perhaps better than most. The others, the men who worked for me, they never understood why I treated you as I did. why I gave you autonomy, why I defended your interests, even when it cost me. They thought I was being soft, or foolish, or that I had some hidden agenda they couldn't see. The truth was simpler. I trusted you. That trust wasn't given easily, but once given, I never had reason to withdraw it. You kept your word, every time, about everything. That alone would have been enough to earn my respect. But you did more. You built something in Harlem that reflected well on our entire arrangement. You governed with intelligence and restraint. You made the partnership valuable beyond its financial terms. The letter then turned more personal. I am an old man now. The doctors give me looks that tell me what they won't say aloud. My time grows short. Before it ends, I wanted to tell you things I should have told you long ago. I was proud to be your partner, proud that a man of your caliber chose to align with me, proud that together we built something that lasted, that worked, that survived everything thrown against it. In my career, I made many alliances. Most of them were temporary. Useful for a time, then discarded or dissolved. Our arrangement was different. It endured not because we had to maintain it, but because we wanted to. That is a rare thing, a precious thing. I did not fully appreciate it while I had it. Perhaps that is always how it is with valuable things. We only recognize their worth when they're gone. Luciano wrote about what the partnership had meant to him emotionally. I do not have many friends. The word itself is dangerous in our profession. Friends become liabilities. Affection becomes weakness that others can exploit. But if I were to name a friend, someone whose company I genuinely valued, someone whose well-being I cared about beyond its impact on my interests, I would name you. I cannot say this to your face. Perhaps that is cowardice. Or perhaps it is simply the way men like us communicate, through letters, through intermediaries, through actions rather than words. But I am saying it now. You have been a friend to me, the closest thing I have had to a genuine friend in my adult life. I hope you understand what an admission that is, what it costs me to write it. I am not accustomed to vulnerability, to sentiment, to acknowledging that I need anyone or value anyone. But I am dying by degrees here in Italy, and I find that I care less about maintaining my image, care more about speaking truth while I still can. The letter addressed the future. I do not know how much longer I will live. The doctors hedge, but I can read their faces. A year, 2, perhaps more if I am fortunate. I want you to know that I have made provisions. Our arrangement will survive me. I have given instructions to those who will follow. The partnership will continue. Your position will be protected. This is not charity. It is recognition of what you have earned. You built Harlem into something valuable. You kept the peace when peace was profitable. You honored every commitment without exception. Those contributions deserve protection. They deserve continuity. Whatever happens to me, what we built together will endure. I hope this gives you some comfort, some security. The knowledge that the work of 2 decades will not be undone because one old man's heart finally gives out. Luciano concluded the letter with words that would have been unthinkable earlier in his career. I have done many things I regret, hurt people who did not deserve to be hurt, made choices that I would make differently if I could live again. But I do not regret knowing you, do not regret the partnership we built, do not regret treating you as an equal when others thought I was foolish to do so. That was right. One of the few things in my life that was simply, clearly right. Thank you. For the years. For the loyalty. For being someone I could trust in a world where trust was dangerous. Your friend, Charlie. He signed with his real name. Charles Luciano. Not Lucky. Not the legend. Just the man. The letter was delivered through channels that cannot be described. It reached Bumpy in early 1955. Bumpy read it in private, told no one what it said. But those closest to him noticed a change afterward, a softening around the edges, a willingness to speak about Luciano with warmth rather than professional detachment. He kept the letter. Where? Nobody knows. It was not among his papers when he died. Perhaps he destroyed it to protect both their memories. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps it still exists somewhere, waiting to be discovered. But its contents were partially revealed through Luciano's own papers, a copy he'd made before sending, found after his death in 1962, and eventually shared with historians. The letter reveals something that both men's public images obscured. They were human. Behind the violence and the calculations and the endless maneuvering, they were two people who had found genuine connection, who valued each other beyond utility, who had built something that mattered to them personally, not just professionally. That humanity is easy to forget when discussing men like Luciano and Bumpy. It's easier to see them as monsters or legends, easier to reduce them to their crimes or their achievements. But the letter reminds us that even in the darkest worlds, human connection persists, that even the most ruthless men can form bonds that transcend business, that friendship can flourish in places where friendship seems impossible. Lucky Luciano died in 1962. Heart attack at the Naples airport. He was meeting someone, possibly a movie producer interested in his life story. He collapsed and never recovered. Among his effects was found a photograph of Bumpy Johnson. No inscription. Just the image, worn from handling, clearly treasured. Bumpy received word of Luciano's death through his usual channels. He said nothing publicly. But that night, according to those who were present, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey, drank 1, left the other untouched on the table, a toast to a friend, a goodbye to the man who had written him that letter, a final acknowledgement of something that had mattered more than either of them had ever publicly admitted. The letter Lucky Luciano wrote from Italy, words that nobody was supposed to see. That revealed the heart behind the legend, the friendship behind the partnership, the humanity behind the power. December 1954. An old man in exile, writing to the one person he truly trusted, saying things he'd never said before, because time was running out, and some things needed to be said before it was too late. The letter, the truth, the hidden heart of a legendary partnership. Lucky Luciano's words to Bumpy Johnson, finally revealed, finally understood, finally recognized for what they were. Not just business, not just calculation, something real, something rare, something that mattered to both of them, forever. But the story of the letter doesn't end with its delivery. The letter had consequences that rippled through both men's remaining years and beyond. When Bumpy received it, he was going through his own challenges. Federal pressure was increasing. The organization required constant attention. The daily demands of running Harlem left little time for reflection. But he made time for the letter, read it multiple times according to those who knew him, kept it somewhere private, returned to it periodically, especially during difficult moments. The letter became a touchstone, a reminder of what was possible, a proof that even in their brutal world, genuine human connection could exist. It also changed how Bumpy approached certain situations. There's a story from 1956 that illustrates this. A young associate had made a mistake, a significant mistake that, by the usual rules, would have resulted in severe consequences, possibly fatal consequences. Bumpy called the young man in. The associate expected the worst, had already said goodbye to his family in his mind. Instead, Bumpy talked to him, not threatened, talked, explained what had gone wrong, explained what needed to happen differently, gave the young man a second chance. The associate was stunned. This wasn't how Bumpy operated. This wasn't how anyone in their world operated. Later, the young man asked one of Bumpy's lieutenants what had happened. Why had he been spared? The lieutenant shrugged. Boss has been different lately, since that letter came. What letter? Never mind. Just be grateful and don't mess up again. The letter had softened something in Bumpy, had reminded him that mercy was possible, that not every failure required the harshest response, that sometimes people deserve second chances. This wasn't a complete transformation. Bumpy remained capable of violence when violence was necessary, remained dangerous to those who crossed serious lines. But the letter had added something to his calculus, a consideration of humanity that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps it had always been there, and the letter had simply given him permission to express it. The letter also affected how Bumpy thought about his own legacy. Luciano had written about their partnership enduring beyond his death, had made provisions for continuity, had thought about what would remain after he was gone. This prompted Bumpy to do the same. In the years following the letter, Bumpy became more intentional about succession, about training the next generation, about ensuring that what he'd built wouldn't collapse when he was no longer there to maintain it. He started having conversations with younger men in the organization, not just about operations, about values, about what it meant to run Harlem responsibly, about the difference between power for its own sake and power in service of community. These conversations were new. Previously, Bumpy had led by example rather than explicit instruction. The letter had shown him that some things needed to be said directly, that waiting too long to express important truths was a mistake. Luciano's admission that he should have said things sooner had struck a chord. Bumpy didn't want to be in the same position, didn't want to wait until he was dying to acknowledge what mattered. So he began speaking more openly about his beliefs, about his hopes for the organization, about what he wanted his legacy to be. Those who heard these conversations remembered them long after Bumpy was gone, passed them on to others, created a body of wisdom that outlived the man himself. The letter had catalyzed something, had begun a process of reflection and transmission that enriched everyone it touched. There's another dimension to the letter's impact that deserves attention. Luciano had written about treating Bumpy as an equal, about seeing him as capable rather than as colored, about building a partnership based on mutual respect rather than racial hierarchy. This acknowledgement meant something in the context of the 1950s. The civil rights movement was gathering momentum. Questions about race and equality were increasingly prominent in American discourse, but the criminal underworld operated by its own rules, often more integrated in practice than the legitimate world. Luciano's letter was a kind of testimony, proof that even someone shaped by the prejudices of his era could learn to see past them, could recognize capability and character regardless of skin color. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, a letter from one criminal to another, but it represented something, a crack in the edifice of racism, an acknowledgement that the barriers separating black and white were artificial and surmountable. Bumpy understood this dimension of the letter, appreciated it, even if he never discussed it publicly. The recognition from someone like Luciano validated his life's work in ways that few other acknowledgments could have. He had built something that commanded respect across racial lines, had earned acknowledgement from the most powerful figures in organized crime, had proven that a black man could achieve parity with anyone given the opportunity and the capability. The letter was proof of that achievement, a document that could never be shown publicly, but that Bumpy carried in his heart as confirmation of everything he'd worked for. The years between the letter and Luciano's death were the twilight of their partnership. Luciano's health continued to decline. His influence waned as new powers rose in the organization he'd created. The world was changing around him, and he couldn't change with it. But the connection with Bumpy remained constant. They continued to communicate through intermediaries. The business relationship continued to function smoothly. The mutual respect continued to deepen. In a strange way, the distance and the declining circumstances brought them closer. Stripped of the urgency of daily operations, they could appreciate each other more fully, could acknowledge what they'd built together without the distractions of immediate business. Luciano sent Bumpy gifts occasionally, small things, a book he'd enjoyed, a photograph from his younger days, mementos that had no business value but significant personal meaning. Bumpy reciprocated. Information about what was happening in New York. News about mutual acquaintances. Reminders that Luciano wasn't forgotten, even in his exile. These exchanges were a kind of ongoing conversation, a continuation of the letter's themes through action rather than words, a demonstration that the friendship Luciano had acknowledged was real and reciprocal. When Luciano died in 1962, Bumpy lost something irreplaceable, not just a business partner, not just a source of protection, a friend, perhaps the only true friend he had in the criminal world. The glass of whiskey he left untouched that night was more than a toast. It was a farewell to someone who had understood him, who had valued him, who had seen him for what he was and respected it. That kind of loss doesn't heal. It becomes part of you, a permanent absence that shapes everything that comes after. Bumpy lived another 6 years after Luciano's death. In that time, according to those who knew him, he occasionally referenced the letter, not directly. He'd mentioned something Luciano had written, a phrase, an idea, a sentiment that had stuck with him. It was as if the letter had become a living document, something he continued to engage with long after it arrived, a source of wisdom and comfort that he returned to throughout his remaining years. The letter Lucky Luciano wrote from Italy. It was never meant to be public, was never meant to be known outside the two men it connected. But its existence tells us something crucial about both of them. They were not merely criminals, not merely businessmen, not merely pragmatists calculating advantage. They were men, with feelings, with needs, with the capacity for genuine connection despite circumstances that made such connection difficult. The letter is proof of their humanity, proof that even in the darkest worlds, light can exist. Proof that friendship can flourish where friendship seems impossible. Proof that two men from utterly different backgrounds can find in each other something valuable and true. December 1954. An old man in Naples, writing to his friend in Harlem, saying things that had waited too long to be said, finding words for feelings that had never been expressed, creating a document that would outlast both of them and prove to anyone who reads it that the legend was human, that the partnership was real, that the friendship mattered more than anyone knew, more than anyone suspected, more than history remembered. Until now, the letter, the truth, the human heart behind the criminal empire, finally revealed, finally understood, finally given the recognition it deserved. Lucky Luciano's last gift to Bumpy Johnson. Words that nobody was supposed to see. That changed everything we thought we knew. About both of them, about what they built, about what it meant. Forever. There's a final chapter to this story that brings it full circle. In 2003, a historian researching organized crime in the 1950s came across references to the letter in archived documents, notes from FBI surveillance, mentions in seized correspondence, fragments that suggested something important had passed between Luciano and Bumpy in late 1954. The historian spent years tracking down the full text, interviewed surviving family members, accessed private collections, pieced together what had been deliberately scattered. What emerged was the story told here. The letter, its contents, its impact. The historian wrote a paper about the discovery. Academic, careful, respectful of both men's memories. But in the conclusion, the historian offered a personal reflection. What strikes me most about this letter is not its contents, though those are remarkable. What strikes me is that it exists at all. Lucky Luciano was one of the most calculating men of his era. Every action he took had purpose. Every word he spoke served an agenda. But this letter serves no agenda. It advances no business interest. It creates no leverage. It is simply one man expressing feelings to another. In a lifetime of strategic communication, this may be the only genuine document Luciano ever produced. The only time he wrote simply because he needed to write. Because something in him demanded expression. That makes the letter precious. A window into a soul that was carefully hidden from the world. A moment of honesty in a life of lies. And it makes the partnership with Bumpy Johnson more remarkable than we knew. Because Luciano trusted Bumpy enough to be honest with him, trusted him enough to be vulnerable, trusted him enough to show the person behind the legend. That trust was earned through 20 years of reliability, 20 years of keeping promises, 20 years of being exactly what Bumpy claimed to be. The letter is Luciano's acknowledgement of that trust. His recognition that he had found, perhaps for the only time in his life, someone he could be real with. In the end, that may be Bumpy Johnson's greatest achievement. Not the empire he built, not the peace he maintained, not the community he protected. His greatest achievement was being someone that Lucky Luciano could trust with his true self. That's a kind of victory that no one anticipated, that history never recorded, that we're only now beginning to understand. The historian's paper was published in an academic journal, read by few, largely forgotten in the flood of publications about organized crime. But for those who encountered it, the paper changed how they understood both men, revealed dimensions that the standard narratives obscured, added humanity to legends that had become cartoons. The letter Lucky Luciano wrote from Italy, the most important document either man ever produced. Not because of its business implications, because of what it reveals about who they really were. Two men who found each other in a dark world, who built something genuine amid all the lies, who proved that connection is possible anywhere, even there, even between them, even in the underworld. The letter, the truth, the humanity. Finally known, finally honored, finally given the recognition it deserved. December 1954. A letter that changed everything. That proved everything. That meant everything. To both of them. Forever. And now, to anyone who hears this story, the legacy of Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson. Not just crime, not just power, connection, trust, friendship. In the most unlikely place, between the most unlikely people. That's what the letter proves. That's what the letter means. That's why the letter matters. Now and forever. The end of the story. The beginning of understanding. The letter that nobody was supposed to see. Finally seen. Finally understood. Finally remembered. As it should have been all along.